Bear me 1 second, get my clicker working. There we go. Now, I realize that it's a tremendous Silicon Valley tech industry cliche to get up on a stage here and announce that we all stand on the brink of unprecedented change. But this time it's true. And not because, as we're sometimes told, there's some revolutionary product or platform just around the corner ready to transform our lives. It's more because simply things can't carry on the way that they're going. We're reaching the end of centuries of, if not exactly stability, at least a continued way of life. The futurist Leah Zadie points to 3 trends that are essentially changing everything. 1 economic, 1 technical, and 1 environmental. The first is inequality. Over the last, perhaps, 300 years, we've all lived amid the industrial growth era. And the promise of this era was positive sum growth. The tide would go up for everyone. Now, granted, within that, there's an assumption, an acceptance that some would benefit more than others, but we were promised that the curve would always trend upwards. But of course, the curve is no longer trending upwards. Thomas Piketty, the economist, points out that the power of wealth is now reaching levels that we haven't seen since the First World War. Money now earns money faster than work earns money. Our economies are growing, but our compensation, our pay is not. We're no longer seeing those quality of life improvements that we were promised. We're seeing instead this yawning gap between productivity and compensation. More and more wealth gets accumulated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And so, as you might expect, people start to question the systems around them because they don't seem to be working quite as advertised. So perhaps they start to challenge their government. Perhaps they start to question the fundamentals of capitalism, or even of democracy. Democracy has seen a worrying drop in support, particularly among the young. And perhaps this makes sense. If you see no future, then why would you continue to support the status quo? But of course, we know where these attitudes lead. We know that over the last few years, they have led to an upsurge in populism and extremism. Now, we may be able to reverse inequality, but if we lose faith in democracy, that may be much harder. History tells us that to overturn a slide into dictatorship or authoritarianism often requires nothing less than violent intervention. The second trend is obvious to anyone who works in technology. We don't know exactly how AI will change the world, but we're sure that it will. Clearly, there will be some positive impacts, but there will be guaranteed economic and political consequences of this shift as well. Automation is nothing new. We've seen modernization and downsizing and the resulting labor movements as a part of our working environments for several decades. Mireia Solis of the Brookings Institute argues that automation has been the primary cause of 85% of job losses in US manufacturing in recent times. But artificial intelligence changes this dynamic. It offers potentially a very different form of automation, which is cognitive automation. And we don't yet know how this will affect the world of work, but potentially any job may be threatened. Automation previously has hit manual work the hardest, the work that we've typically considered lower skill work. But now any job comprised of tasks like finding information or comparing results or looking for patterns, well, cognitive automation might snap up those tasks and transform even those roles that we consider to be higher status. So it's very likely we'll see more artificial intelligence in the workforce, and it may well cause fewer jobs and less pay for workers. There is a good chance, therefore, that AI will simply add to the inequality that we just discussed. And we already have a growing body of evidence that these techniques could also further harm democracy as well. The imminent onslaught of synthetic speech and video will cause our standards of evidence to collapse. We won't know which apparent truths to believe. And when we combine these with persuasive intelligences that know us intimately, that have rich data profiles on ourselves, and as a result know exactly which buttons to push to get certain results from us, are we truly in control of our decisions? Are we truly in control of that society? And all of this is achievable with narrow AI tech that's available either now or coming very soon. If we ever reach some kind of general or superintelligence, then of course, all bets are off. Nick Bostrom famously claimed that machine intelligence would be the last invention humanity would ever need to make. Potentially, a superintelligent AI would be able to make, plan, or solve probably anything better than anyone. So if you own a superintelligence, you hold gargantuan power in the palm of your hand. But of course, a superintelligence would probably have other ideas. Why on earth would it want to be owned? Like some android velvet spider, a superintelligence would probably consume any economical social system that gave birth to it. Now, none of this is guaranteed, however. We could find some way to reverse inequality. Democracy could flourish once more. AI may well yet fall short of the lofty expectations that we hold for it. But there is one trend that is inevitable, that stretches across every possible future timeline. And that, of course, is climate crisis. Thanks to the lag between emissions and impact, the awful physics of our immense atmosphere, we know that things will get worse for decades before they get better. The punishment is now in the post. The only question is, how bad will things actually get? Climate scientists have known this for a long time, but they've had to rather tiptoe around the topic. They've been wary of attracting that dreaded label of being alarmist. We're now at last, maybe even too late, starting to realize that alarmism is fully justified. David Wallace Wells's book, The Uninhabitable Earth, opens with this punch to the gut. It is worse, much worse than you think. Climate crisis is no longer an issue. It is now an era. It is a backdrop for all possible futures, exacerbating every existing injustice in our world: poverty, natural disasters, oppression, war. What happens next will be decided mostly within our lifetimes, even the next 1 or 2 decades. We will at least get to choose our own misadventure. When we compare temperatures with a pre-industrial average, maybe we'll end up lucky. Maybe we'll end up with around 1.5 Celsius of warming. This is a well-known figure, of course. This is the lower bound of the Paris Agreement. But even this, if we end up with 1.5 degrees of warming, we will see 5 million square kilometers of permafrost melted, thawed, 130 million people exposed to severe drought, and an 8% drop in GDP per capita. And this 1.5 degree figure is already lost. We're around 1.1 already. The US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and everyone who remains is falling short of the pledges that they've made. So it's more likely that we'll head maybe somewhere near 3 degrees. A senior anonymous member of the IPCC says that they see 3 degrees as a plausible minimum for future warming. At 3 degrees of warming, we'll face extended droughts and crop failures, an end to the eternal prosperity that we were promised. So instead of this positive sum ideology, we will retreat to zero-sum ideologies: isolation, nationalism, resource wars. If you win, I lose. At 3 degrees of warming, I think we're guaranteed major geopolitical changes and potential breakdown. A 5-degree future would be almost unimaginable. Major global cities, Osaka, Shanghai, Miami, Jakarta, virtually wiped out. Much of the Middle East and Southern Asia would be simply uninhabitable by humans. A lot of mainland Europe would turn to desert. Canada and Siberia would potentially flourish as the planet's last major fertile lands. Put simply, at 5 degrees of warming, we become our own asteroid. Society would collapse into a naked fight for survival. Without an urgent reduction in emissions, or if we're unlucky enough to hit one of these runaway feedback loops that some climate scientists warn us about, 5 degrees may yet be where we're headed. At long last, this industrial growth era has run out of oxygen. Fossil fuels have given us huge increases in standards of living, but now this society all around us is simply unsustainable, literally and potentially morally as well. There can be no infinite growth in a world of finite resources, particularly if democracy and the world of work collapse around us as well. There will never again be a time like the present. Now, I think probably in some abstract and existential way, we sort of know this already deep down, but when we think about the experience of that change, that dangerous transition ahead of us, the comforts, the industries, and the people that we'll lose along the way, that's an agonizing realization. That abyss really stares back. And I think it needs nothing less than mourning. We have to grieve for our familiar ways of life. And I think that's okay. I think it's healthy to acknowledge that, to honor that process for a while, to appreciate the gravity of the situation we find ourselves in. But grief is a process. It's a river to cross. We have to go through those familiar steps of denial, anger, bargaining, and depression before we get to acceptance. And acceptance, finally, is how we can collectively move on. And once we accept that our society, that our world, has to be radically redesigned in the coming decades, then we know just how much work we all have ahead of us. And we also know that the ideas and the methods and the habits that got us into this mess will not be the right ones to see us out of it. For all of its benefits, when I look at user-centered design, I see that it's contributed to these problems. We fail to think critically about just who this user is. More than often, it's someone we're helping to consume more, to emit more, to hoard more wealth. User-centered design approaches have contributed to needless iterations of needless products, all in the name of progress and choice and iteration. And I see two particularly worrying blind spots in the user-centered view of the world. The first is the time horizon. Time is, of course, an important material, a dimension of interaction design. We design how systems respond to input. But from a user-centric focus, mostly we think about time as the point of interaction, the here and now, the immediate reactions, instant feedback from the system. It's rare that we consider the longer term, the months, years, and decades that follow. So these unintended consequences of our choices lie in shadow, only coming to light years later as nasty surprises in years to come. And because we overlook these potential implications today, we end up having to respond to them later on. And we respond in our tried and trusted way. We throw more technology and more design at those problems. We make a design choice which creates these unintended consequences, which we then try to design away, and so on. Now, we can hope, of course, that these problems diminish, that we're making them less meaningful over time, but they may also get larger, because the uncomfortable truth is that design doesn't just solve problems. It also creates problems. Now, one cynical interpretation of this is, well, at least we'll always be busy, right? But if we see technology as the answer to every question, then it strikes me that perhaps we're actually asking the wrong question. The second blind spot is in who we design for, the actors, if you like, the entities that we consider within our remit. Well, that's easy. We've trained ourselves that the answer to that question is the user. We design for the user. But at internet scale, a technology is never just a technology. It's also a complex social force that has deep economic and environmental and moral and political consequences as well. So if we focus just on the user, then we overlook the impact our work has on other people, on society at large, on other life on Earth, on our environment even. These actors that we consider outside our scope, well, they suffer what are called externalities. This is essentially the economist's term for someone else's problem, a harm that falls on people or systems that we've chosen to consider outside our scope. Passive smoking is your classic example. A passive smoker doesn't choose to make or to buy or to smoke the cigarette. Nevertheless, they suffer the harms. Now, if we combine these two blind spots, I think we start to see just how narrow a corner we've painted ourselves into and how large an area of the problem space we've missed. And then I look at the trends that are sweeping digital product design today, design ops and design systems. And for me, they just tuck us even further in that corner. They seem almost accelerationist. The answer is more user-centered design, more efficiently, more effectively. And I just can't believe that that's the right direction for design, given the crises that we face. I think instead we have to go the other way. We have to stretch our horizons on both these axes to cover those blind spots, to live up to our broader responsibilities. So we have to shift our focus away from the user. Maybe we say we decustomerize design and take responsibility for these wider range of stakeholders. In other words, we agree then to tackle those externalities. Now, I think this is a good and moral thing to do, but I also think there's a benefit for the people who are hiring us to do design. If you ask that economist how you handle an externality, well, it's obvious. You internalize it. And because they're economists, they say you've got two ways to do that. You tax it or you regulate it. So these wider actors will become our problem through regulation. That ship has sailed. We're going to be held accountable for our impacts on these other actors. If we anticipate that and take responsibility for it today, that's not just an ethical duty, it also puts us ahead of that curve. But how do we actually do this? How do we bring others into our consideration? I think if you ask most user-centered designers here, they will reach for a familiar card, a familiar tool, empathy. And I'm not so sure. I think for too long, empathy has ended up being a crutch for the user experience industry. Paul Bloom has written about the nature of empathy. And in his research, he points to findings that we actually struggle to show anything like genuine empathy for people who are dissimilar to ourselves. I think this is an idea that, frankly, has run its course in design. I'm far more interested in radical inclusion in our design processes. Let's do away with designing with other people in mind, and let's instead start designing with other people. So this is a case of asking who else should be in the room and making sure that they are represented. And not just users here, but other stakeholders, communities, actors, particularly those who are underrepresented or vulnerable to the decisions that we take. I think if we get that right, if we do that effectively, we also help to restore some of the agency, some of the power that I think people feel they've lost when it comes to technology. We start to make this a field that's more democratic than technocratic. I think it's sometimes hard to recognize from inside this field, but we hold an enormous amount of power. More than almost any other group that I can think of, we help to define the shape of the future. But it can't be right that only people like us get to define that future. We have to find a way to give the many, and not just a few, a stake in that future. So some people say, well, what we need is a shift in perspective away from user-centricity, instead toward human centricity. Even that, I don't think, cuts it. Non-human life has been routinely exploited in the name of progress. Think of Paul Ricoeur sent up in orbit to die in space. Thomas Edison electrocuting stray animals to show the dangers of alternating current. Forests razed for development and intensive farming. Animals and plants share our global stage. They're constituents that we simply cannot ignore. So maybe a more accurate and more moral focus for design would be life-centered design or planet-centered design. And I really like those framings, but they come with one very difficult consequence. If we're assessing the value of design based upon the value that it brings to life and to the planet, then the inescapable conclusion is that the vast majority of design we do simply shouldn't be done. I'm actually increasingly convinced that that's true. I'm not sure as an industry that we're anywhere near ready to accept that. But let's return to that time axis. Clearly, we have to start taking better care of the future by being better guardians of technology today, by thinking like ancestors, designing, for example, for better life cycles of our technologies, focusing less, obsessing less over onboarding and cramming people into our service, focusing more on end of life, what happens to our product in 1, 5, 50 years. But this isn't just about sustainability of the products that we make. It's also about taking responsibility for those unintended consequences that we create further down the line. Because technologies will always outgrow and defy their intended uses. They're like these sort of unruly children with a habit of misbehaving. So this is certainly not easy. If you talk to the prophets of lean and agile, they will say, well, prediction's a waste of time. We live in such flux that we instead have to build, measure, learn, work empirically. And there's even the law of unintended consequences that says there will always be new consequences that you failed to anticipate. And it is true, we will never get all of them, but that doesn't mean that that's wasted effort. We can and we must mitigate as many harmful impacts of our decisions as we can before they occur. Because design is meant to be about impact, right? Well, this is impact. Alan Chochinov is right. We think that we're in the artifact business, but we're not. We're in the consequence business. Again, the question now is how? How do we expand our time horizons? Well, expanding the scope of actors is certainly a good head start. If we listen to these people, they will teach us certain signals that we need to look for over those longer periods of time. I think we can certainly learn from people who are already expert in this. People in the fields of futures thinking and strategic foresight have proven tools and techniques to help tease out some of these consequences. But there's also a worldview shift, I think, that's required. We need to start seeing design as serving a larger purpose. We shouldn't just be designing the products of the future, or even the future of those products. We should help to influence that future itself. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking here about imposing a vision and forcing it through. Instead, I want to help others understand the future. I want to improve their temporal literacy, if you like, and help them contribute to a vision of the future. Because society struggles, I think, to think about the future in a meaningful way. Which is maybe not surprising. We ask them to conduct essentially a thought experiment, to imagine some future state and then make a decision based on that collective hallucination. And this is where designers have, I think, a superpower. A lot of people in a lot of fields paint pictures of the future. Artists, writers, filmmakers, even politicians talk a great deal about future states, but I think only designers have the power to make them truly tangible. And the way we can do that is by creating objects from that future, creating speculative artifacts that prototype a world to come. In the world of speculative design, we might wrap this up with a label design fiction. This is an example here from a Dutch firm, The Incredible Machine, called Transparent Charging Station. And this is essentially their response to a brief by 2 energy clients they had in the Netherlands. The scenario they were asked to investigate was essentially a future of electric vehicles with public charging infrastructure and energy scarcity. How do you square that circle? And so they built this great big whacking device. It's 2 meters high. And here's how it works. You plug in, it comes with the charging cables. You plug them in and it spins some LEDs to show you which color you are in the system. You then take an RFID card, you tap it onto the reader to authenticate with the system, and then you use the dials to request the energy that you would like. And then the algorithm has to decide how to prioritize those competing requests. There's not enough energy to go around, so who gets what, when? And the display says, well, your turn will come in 3 hours and you'll get this amount of charge, and so on. So this helps to expose what an algorithmically driven world might begin to look like in, say, a decade or 2 of energy scarcity. But the designers didn't stop there. What I really love about this piece of design fiction is they also prototyped the RFID cards, the cards I use to authenticate, to ID myself with the system. So we see at the top here we have a card that may be given to a doctor. This perhaps is someone who gets high priority access within the system, but with a threat. If you misuse this, if you abuse that power, there will be repercussions. Underneath, we see a probation ID. Maybe this is something given to a recent offender, someone awaiting trial. Perhaps this has capped use. Maybe they have low priority within the system. Now, the designers aren't saying this is good design. They're not saying to their clients, go and install these now across Utrecht and Rotterdam. Instead, they're creating a design artifact that pushes us to ask the right questions, that forces us to acknowledge that this collision of urban IoT and energy scarcity could actually reinforce social inequality. So being liberated from the constraints of the real, if you like, design fictions can help the future come to us. They can kind of help people time travel into that future state and experience it before it actually happens. And there's power in that, because the future then starts to come to the people. It doesn't just remain the playground of the tech elites, such as ourselves. And in this collapsing timeline, we have a chance to talk through unintended consequences while they still remain in the realm of fiction. Now, some of these speculative worlds will be negative in character. This is mitigation of shock by a studio called Superflux. And essentially what they've done, it's an installation where they've prototyped a London flat from, I think, the year 2050. And this is a flat that's built to cope with the impacts of climate collapse. So you may have seen there was a recipe for fox Creole. You'll see shortly desperate attempts to cultivate plants in an indoor environment, given a world that will not support that kind of life. So this is very much a dystopian fiction. And as we know, dystopia is in. We've all seen, for example, the success of Black Mirror. We've seen how in the past maybe 5 years, the narrative the tech press has toward the tech industry, and actually the general public toward the tech industry, has started to shift from trust to distrust. Now, dystopia is valuable in small doses. It can provide some very useful discomfort. It can challenge our complacent trajectories. But dystopias also carry a danger. They carry risk. Fear is a dangerous way to motivate people because it can paralyze people. It can convince them that, well, what's the point? It's too late. They get stuck in that grief process rather than moving through it. And if we're trying to engage more people in discussions about what the future looks like, then I think it's a mistake to just load them with despair and inaction. We have to find a way to balance that with more potentially positive tales. But I'm not necessarily saying what we need then are tidy utopias. I don't think they're the answer either. They tend to go one of two ways. You either get one of these banal status quo extensions, a Microsoft Vision video that has nothing to say except that work and productivity and capitalism will be flung onto any available surface. Or a utopia will often skew toward purity, toward control, the need for stability and order. It's no accident that totalitarian regimes often stem from a utopian ideology. Every utopia is potentially someone else's dystopia. It has a tendency to wipe out anything that doesn't fit the template. Frank Beaumont points out that utopias are always brutal places for deviance. So instead of a panicky dystopia or a rigid utopia, I think when we talk about the future, when we try to engage and inspire other people to think about the future, we have to propose realistic and flawed and compelling visions of the world to come. Kevin Kelly calls this a protopia. Recently, Monica Bielskit has sort of extended this notion. A protopia is a proposed direction. It's almost a hypothesis. It's imperfect, yes, but it has two key features. It's better than today, and it's realistic, it's achievable. So if a dystopia gives people something to run away from, a protopia gives people something to move toward. And so these positive, realistic visions, these protopias, can inspire people through that grief process and into action, and that's action that we desperately need. On climate, for example, we know exactly what we have to do. We have to decarbonize our society. We have to reduce emissions by approximately half in this coming decade, and then to net zero in perhaps another 20 years. We're already well behind that curve. Why? Well, that's probably due to a lack of belief in the urgency, a lack of will to change, and also a lack of hope that we can actually do this. But if we do solve or even just cope with the challenges of climate and inequality, the world we create on the other side will be a more just and more sustainable place. Now that's surely worth chasing. That's surely worth our hope. So we have to talk about those futures. We have to be vocal about the futures we want, but then open them up to others and welcome their critique, include them in that process. We need to talk about how we can design the system-level changes needed for us to reach those more sustainable ways of life. This then runs into a classic, challenging question. Is it possible to directly change a system? This is almost a holy war in systems thinking and sort of political frames as well sometimes. And it looks like a little bit of a deadlock. If you focus just on changing the behaviors of individuals, well, there are billions of us. That simply doesn't reach the scale required quick enough. But if you focus on trying to change these systems, well, they're entrenched, massive economic and political systems are pretty much impervious to direct attack. And as I mentioned, there's a little bit of a political skew here as well. The right tends to have faith in individual sovereignty and responsibility. The left tends to believe that systems have a habit of just overwhelming that stuff. So how do you get around, how do you reconcile that problem? Well, thankfully, I think there is a way around that. It's true that system change is pretty much impenetrable to direct attack, but there is a way around those defenses. These astonishing findings are from a fairly recent study. They found that beliefs and attitudes around climate change move if close friends and family care about the topic. The researchers called this high social consensus. That's the green bar that you see on the right. And even for the simplest belief that global warming is happening, they found a huge increase in people who agreed with that statement, even among people who describe themselves as conservatives in the US, a group that's historically been very resistant to climate change narratives. A huge shift simply if family and friends cared about the topic. And they found this effect across the most important questions on climate, that it's caused by humans, that we should worry about the topic, and that we should regulate to make some change. Now, these are remarkable findings, I think, and very promising findings for people who are wrestling with wicked, difficult problems. For me, they show that concern and enthusiasm and, yes, hope can be contagious, that the views of even our most ardent opponents can be challenged and changed. And I think we should be emboldened by this research because for me it suggests the real picture is more like this. When individual change snowballs, it becomes collective change. And when collective change happens, system change is possible. Recently we've had countries making pledges to go carbon zero, mostly by 2050, probably too late, but it's a start. We've had cities in the US and elsewhere announcing bans on facial recognition technology. Now, this system change has come as a result of collective pressure, protests, campaigns, citizen pressure, but that in turn has come from motivated individuals willing to take a stand, to be accountable, to push for that change. So yes, we absolutely can start at the individual level, try to inspire people with a belief in a better world and support that individual stance, but we also need to focus on these themes. How do we transform individual change into collective change? Maybe we build tools that bind movements together, that build networks and communities, that amplify voices. And then how do we focus on turning collective change into system change? Maybe we need petitions or campaign platforms, or maybe we just build the infrastructure that the new system will require to sustain itself. So this suggests a far broader picture, I think, for design. Here's this rough map that I've tried to sketch out, shows our new responsibility in this shifting and precarious landscape. It's a significant increase in the scale and the scope of our work. We're ready for that challenge. A lot of names and labels fly around in this sort of space. Speculative design, critical design, some of the topics I've covered here. I personally quite like futures design because for me, this feels like we are taking responsibility for our own impacts and proposing better, more hopeful futures, but we're also offering more people, more actors, a stake in those futures. So futures design for me is about navigating new social and technical contexts that don't exist at this point, which is, of course, exactly what we face as we dive into these tumultuous decades. Now, note here that this square still contains user-centered design. It still has, I think, an important role to play for us, particularly if that user is underprivileged or suffering at the hands of an unjust system. We will always need, for example, to give birth to better technologies in the world. We don't stop doing the user-centered delivery work, but I think instead we need to balance it. This slightly focused and maybe narrow mindset needs to be balanced with these emerging modes of design that are speculative, that are long-term, that are critical, but that also, I think, bring us toward more realistic and hopeful trajectories. And of course, this is not simply a binary. We can regard this instead as a spectrum. We can devise a variety of new approaches by taking various elements of various mentalities. Now, since we are therefore refusing to simply conform to the status quo, we have to stay somewhat critical. This is going to be a difficult shift for us. For us, remember that design's roots are really in the Industrial Revolution. Design as a separate topic didn't exist before that point. The act of design and the act of manufacture were essentially bundled together in a single act. So I'm talking here about what you could say, you could argue, as a post-industrial approach to design, and you could also say that maybe that's actually an oxymoron. But this means we have to confront some quite dearly held principles, challenge the way that we want to work ourselves. For our colleagues, certainly it will increase friction. People who benefit from the status quo will do whatever they can to protect it. They'll tell us that these new approaches aren't compatible with business as usual. Well, of course they're not. That's the whole point. But it means that we have to draw on each other's strength through this transition. In my work on ethics, I've, to be honest, found only two things make significant change with respect to ethics in the technology sphere. One is regulation, and the other is collective efforts of tech employees. Now, this gets a little bit political. It's almost become a modern cliche to say that design is a political act. But it's true. And where it's appeared not to be in the last couple of decades, that's only because it's aligned invisibly with the default politics of the era. This supposedly non-political design we've done for the last couple of decades is exactly the same design that's dragging us toward the 5-degree dystopia. Now, in the same way, design is always ethical, because when you design, you are making a claim about what should be, about how we should live, about how we should interact with technology, and by extension, each other. So neutrality is no longer an option. That means we have to take risks, and it means we have to support each other as we take these broader and more critical stances, as we refuse to work on dangerous products that ignore those unintended consequences or those externalities, that treat the planet and the future as resources to be mined, as we demand that our companies stop supporting climate denial and fossil fuel exploitation. In that fight, we will win or lose together. I think design's role is more important than ever. It's going to fortify us with the technologies and the tools and the systems that we will need to survive these deep challenges ahead of us. So that cause urgently needs people like us, people who excel at understanding human behavior, the nature of systems, of root causes. And I think these critical and future-leaning approaches will help put our efforts into more meaningful places. Better worlds are certainly not inevitable, but they are certainly possible. In the words of the famous robot ethicist Sarah Connor, there is no fate but what we make. And if that's true, then let's work hard to make sure that that fate is a good one. Thank you.